Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for coming. Today, we're going to be exploring how Canada can provide clean, secure energy to meet demand in Japan and Korea. My name is Marla Orenstein, and I'm the director of the Natural Resources Center at the Canada West Foundation. In case you aren't familiar with the Canada West Foundation, we are an independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank that focuses on the policies that shape the West and, by extension, Canada. Our mission is to provide practical solutions to tough public policy challenges facing the West and Canada as a whole. I also want to send a big thank you to Bennet Jones, who is sponsoring today's webinar, and we'll get to hear from their managing director, Pat McGuire, at the end of the webinar. Before we get to our panelists, who are fantastic, I have to say, we're going to have the privilege of hearing from two ambassadors, His Excellency Yamanouchi Kanji, Ambassador of Japan to Canada, and His Excellency Im Ong-soon, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to Canada. They've both agreed to provide some brief opening remarks and to give us context for what we'll be hearing today and to reinforce that this really is an important issue for both countries. So Ethan, can you turn this over to the ambassadors now for a few minutes?
Hello everyone. Ohayou gozaimasu. 안녕하십니까, our friends in Japan and South Korea. Good afternoon, our friends in Canada. Mr. Gary Ma, thank you so much for having me here today. It is my honor to be part of this very important webinar, Canada's role of supporting energy needs of Japan and South Korea. This is very significant and very timely because we have experienced very complicated energy situation in terms of geopolitics and global warming. Actually, this energy, or energy security, I should say, is an intersection among market economy, green economy, and geopolitics. Therefore, I really believe Canada can and should play a very important key role to support energy situation, not only just Japan, South Korea, but also the world, entire world. The world is waiting for Canada's significant role in many ways. I do believe there are three reasons why Canada should and can play this important role. First, Canada's richness of natural resources, gas and oil and critical minerals. Canada's energy self-sufficiency rate is close to 200%. That shows enormous ability for Canada to support the world. The second, Canada is a member of G7 and TPP, leading role of the world politics and economics. And also, Japan and Canada share the very significant basic value like human rights and democracy and market economy and etc. Canada has just issued IPS, Indo-Pacific Strategy. Japan has issued its national security strategy that coincides perfectly. And Prime Minister Kishida just visited Ottawa, have a discussion with Prime Minister Trudeau in many things, both politics and economics and businesses, of course, energy security too. And third, in Canada, big private investment project is going on, LNG Canada. That is game changer. If everything goes well, by the end of 2024, the first shipment of LNG will be sent to Japan. That will be a game changer. But before closing my opening remarks, I would mention three challenges that Canada has been facing. One, infrastructure, transportation is a key. The second, very serious regulatory regime and also procedures. It may take a long time for business to make a decision. And third, we definitely need the understanding and support from the indigenous people. But those three challenges should be met. We can work together for Canada to play a key role in terms of energy. And I really do look forward to productive and insightful discussion of today's webinar. Thank you very much. Have a productive meeting. ありがとうございます。
His Excellency Ambassador Yamanouchi Kanji of Japan, distinguished panelists and participants from Korea, Japan, and Canada, I'm honored to make a remark for Canada West Foundation webinar today. The theme of the webinar, Can Canada Provide Clean, Secure Energy to Meet Demand in Korea and Japan, couldn't be more timely and relevant, as Korea and Canada are building a strong partnership on clean energy. Substantial energy cooperation between Korea and Canada dates back to the 1970s, when the Korean company started the joint development of mine in Canada, and Korea decided to import CANDU nuclear reactors. Our two countries have since broadened and deepened our energy partnership. On the trade side, raw materials such as iron and copper account for 28% of our total trade volumes, and the energy sector has driven surges in investments from traditional energy like coal, oil, and gas to renewable energy, which is now expanded to electric vehicle batteries. Above all, Canadian LNG will be exported to Korea after the completion of LNG Canada project in 2025. Like Canada, Korea was among the first countries to enact law with carbon neutrality by 2050 in 2021. Korea has a very ambitious target to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 40% from 2015 levels by 2030. As a manufacturing powerhouse, Korea's goals call for an economy-wide transition for clean energy and more robust partnership with clean energy suppliers. Last September, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau agreed to upgrade our bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership based on 5 shared priorities. 2 of the 5 priorities are related to clean energy cooperation. The first is enhancing economic prosperity and security, cooperating on supply chains, critical minerals, and STNI, and promoting trade and investment. The other one is addressing climate change and the environment, supporting energy security, and developing sustainable energy sources. To implement these shared visions into action, our two governments set out to launch a high-level dialogue on economic security. This platform will enable us to seek ways to deepen our strategic partnership on supply chain resilience and energy cooperation. As we set out to launch various high-level dialogues for clean and secure energy, I believe today's webinar will present good opinions and suggestions for policymakers and opinion leaders, and we'll try to incorporate them into concrete action plans to realize our shared visions. Lastly, my sincere gratitude goes out to everyone involved in organizing this webinar, and I wish you a most fruitful and engaging event. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the ambassadors there for their comments. I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate too the help of the staff of the ambassadors and of the Consulate General in Vancouver of Korea for helping us arrange this. It's been spectacular. So now we're going to go to our 4 panelists, and while Ethan is bringing them in, I also want to let you know that we have both the chat and the Q&A functions enabled. At the end, we're going to be asking for some questions from the audience. So if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A. If you just make a comment that you want to share with everybody else, please use the chat. So again, Q&A for questions for the panelists, chat for comments, and any other thing that you want to say. So now we have these 4 amazing panelists who've also agreed to get up very early in the morning, which I really appreciate, to do this webinar. Instead of my reading out their biographies, I have asked them if they would be willing to introduce themselves, because I always find reading those things to be deadly to listen to. So Ken, we're going to go to you first. Ken Mizutani, I should know that we have Ken Mizutani, Carl Pires, Won Cho, and Dulles Wang. Ken, can we go to you first for an introduction? Who are you and what brings you here?
Thank you, Mala. Thank you for having me today. My name is Ken. I'm currently Deputy Director and Legal Counsel at Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Security, in short, JOGMEC. We were formerly known as Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corporation, even before that as JNOC, Japan National Oil Corporation. My background is in upstream oil and gas, but in the recent years, I've worked in carbon neutrality projects, hydrogen projects, and CCS. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks so much. Carl, can we move to you next?
Yes, thank you, Marla. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you may be joining from. I'm Carl Pires. I'm a partner at the global law firm of Sherman and Sterling, seated in the Tokyo office, and I head our Japan M&A practice. I'm also a governor of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Japan, and I'm happy to see that a number of our members are joining today. Thank you. I'm originally from Victoria, British Columbia. I have a long history in Japan. I came here after studying economics and Japanese at UVic, and I worked in Wakayama Prefecture for a few years on Canada-Japan relations. And after going back to law school, University of Toronto, I then started my legal career in Vancouver at a national firm. When I started to get a bit into energy, mostly on the hydro side, of course, and again, in the Canada-Japan business relations, where I was also a director there of the Japan-Canada Chamber of Commerce. I returned to Japan in 2008, so about 15 years ago, and since then, my practice has been very heavily focused on the energy and power industry. I was seconded for 1 year to Osaka Gas, one of the largest gas companies in the world, and since then have worked on a number of cross-border transactions representing Japanese energy companies, including actually running into Pat McGuire almost 15 years ago, I think, of Bennet Jones when he was on for Mitsubishi in the shale gas developments in Cordova Montney, and I was working for some of the Japanese investors. So thank you very much. I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carl. It's a large world, but a small world at the same time. Juan, can we hear from you next? Who are you? Oh, you're on mute, though. Still on mute. Dulles, why don't we skip over to you while Juan is unmuting himself, and then we can move back towards him.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you very much, Marla. My name is Dulles Wang. I am part of the North America Gas and LNG team. I am actually based in Calgary, so no need for me to get up early today. So time actually worked well. So really great to meet everybody. And thank you for calling in, and thank you for inviting me for this webinar today.
That's great. Our pleasure. And Juan, it looks like you may have solved your muting problem.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the wait. My name is Won Cho. I'm with Korea Gas Corporation. Company is celebrating 40 years of operation ever since 1983. The company is responsible for securing energy, especially the natural gas for the country of South Korea. And I am in charge of overseas project development and also LNG marketing and anything related to that business, such as other utility businesses. Especially, I've been working on the LNG Canada business ever since 2009, when it was taking a baby step. So I can heavily relate it to the Canada business. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks. Well, I'm eager to dive right in. I have to say, we had a prep call among all of the panelists about a week ago, and my God, the amount of rich information that was coming out was spectacular. So I'm very excited for you to be able to share it with the audience today. I want to start by saying it's been a very interesting and a very challenging year for energy delivery and energy security globally. I think much of our audience knows about the shortages that have been experienced in Europe this winter and the skyrocketing energy prices there. But most people in the audience don't really know about the situation in Japan and Korea. So can you tell us what generally are the types of energy that Japan and Korea mostly rely on, and how has this last winter been for availability and prices? Ken, let's start with you.
Sure, I'll be happy to discuss a few topics from Japan. So I think in the recent years, especially with the geopolitics and the current situation, energy security has become one of the key national policy considerations in Japan. Even my company's name, JOGMEC, has changed. So we're under the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and our task is to secure, natural resources and energy for the Japanese economy. But our name was changed to include the term energy security. One of the key factor is Japan is a net energy importer. So our energy sufficiency ratio is only about 12%. And as His Excellency, the Ambassador of Japan to Canada has alluded to, Canada has a sufficiency ratio of around 180%. So that's a huge gap between Canada and Japan. Now, when it comes to primary energy supply for Japan, Japan actually relies on fossil fuels, of which close to 86% is basically fossil fueled imported from abroad. When it comes to crude oil, we import 99.7%, of which 88% is from the Middle East. So that's a huge dependence on a single region in the world. When it comes to LNG from abroad, we import 97.7%, mostly from Australia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Even when it comes to coal, it's 99.5%. So that's a huge foreign reliance. And even if we discuss about minerals, for lithium, cobalt, and nickel, we import 100%. So that's in terms of carbon neutrality, in terms of energy security, that's a huge foreign reliance for Japan. So that's our current situation.
Thanks so much for that, Ken. Carl, I know you had during our earlier discussion some other observations that you thought you might want to add here. Do you have anything else that you want to add about, again, the energy picture in Japan in general, and particularly how this last winter has been for people? Have the prices been skyrocketing the same way that they have in Europe?
Yes, indeed. We have seen for the households, definitely our bills every month for electricity have doubled or has tripled in some cases. So it has been a very costly winter in that sense. I guess I can add that Japan is certainly trying to diversify their energy mix going forward. They have strategies out for 2030 and 2050 in terms of carbon neutrality, moving towards carbon neutrality by 2050 in terms of trying to add renewables to the mix. But at this point, it's still very slow, and it's going to be difficult to go completely renewable given the resources in Japan. We have onshore wind, offshore wind is coming in soon, and solar, but that's still a relatively small percentage, 10% maybe. I mean, of course we have hydro as well in certain parts of Japan, but for the most part a lot of the renewables are not seen as kind of reliable in terms of base load power. So we don't see LNG especially really being reduced much. Coal, I think there's an effort to reduce the reliance on coal and oil as well, but we think LNG, especially to the extent that the nuclear power is slow to come back. It is coming back slowly, and the government wants to try and get it back up to 20%. I think it's currently around 7% of energy mix, up from 0 a few years ago, but yeah, it's not clear.
Before 2011? Do you have any recollection of what percentage of power was nuclear before 2011?
I believe it was somewhere around 25%. Ken might correct me on that, but
yeah, I think that's correct. Japan was trying to increase it up to 1/4 of its total energy supply with nuclear. So that was back then the sort of the overall goal, and we were quite close, getting close to it. And then after Fukushima, it had to go down.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Juan, can you give us the picture of how are things in Korea, both in terms of what sort of energy mix does Korea rely on, and how has this last year been for Korea for energy consumers?
It's kind of surprising because our energy situation is very similar to Japan. We rely heavily on the imports of energy. We don't have a local production of LNG nor oil. So most of those energy sources being imported from, just like Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, some from US, some from Middle East. And last year, it was about 27% of LNG was provided to Korea. And this just about 35% was still coal. 25 to 26% was from nuclear. So those are three big energy sources. Of course, we're trying to reduce coal, but then again, due to the pandemic and also the rising price of energy sources, it was very difficult to move away from sort of the cheap, or I shouldn't say cheap, but more affordable way of energy sources to more, costly energies. So the dependency on coal still stay the same. Dependency on LNG has been increased a little bit more. Nuclear was not so much focused before, but along with the Japan's restart of the nuclear, our new government is also thinking about having the nuclear restarted, even building more nuclear powers. So the economy actually is the biggest factor on our energy mix.
That's great. Thank you very much. You've both talked somewhat about LNG, which is a topic that I really want to dive into more deeply. And Dulles, I'm going to be putting the finger on you next here. Can we talk about the imports right now of LNG into Japan and Korea, and especially how this is likely to change in the future, given the sanctions against Russia and concerns about other potentially volatile governments? What are we seeing now, Dulles, and do you have any ideas about what might be changing over time?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think this is a great question following what Carl and Juan talked about in terms of energy security in Japan and Korea. Right now, I think it's probably well known that Japan is the largest LNG importer in the world. I think last year was China, this year is Japan. And then I think, probably 2022, 23 is going to be Japan. And between Japan, and just to give people some numbers or just a context of how much the market is, between Japan and South Korea, we're talking about something around 125 million tons of LNG imports. That's around 15, 16 BCF per day in terms of production, in terms of imports. And right now, Canada produces something around 17 to 18 BCF per day of gas. So that just means that, the amount of the market potential in Japan and Korea is tremendous, and just because both markets consume a lot of LNG. What's interesting in 2022, though, and I think, given the context of, the amount of LNG that both countries import, is just how little change we saw in LNG imports into Japan and Korea, and the fact that I think we saw a lot of price-induced demand response in different markets across the world. So Europe shifting away from the Russian pipe imports into LNG, that drives up a lot of the prices in the spot market. But for Japan and for South Korea, we actually see relatively minimal impact, because most of the contracts for those countries are under long-term contracts. So for them, for those countries, for both Japan and Korea, because of the indexation to oil and relatively the long-term contract nature, we didn't really see much of the same kind of price volatility that we saw in the spot market into the long-term contracting market. So to us, we think having security, having the contracting security, having the energy security is definitely very beneficial, especially during the turmoil that we saw and the geopolitical concerns that we saw back in 2022. And one last part, just to talk about in terms of going forward, we do see quite a lot of, a number of these long-term contracts that Japan and Korea have signed over the last 15 years or 15, 20 years coming into expiration in the next 5 to 10 years. I think one statistic is that, probably closer to 20 to 25% of the long-term contracts that Japan has is going to be up for renewal or up for renegotiation over the next 5 to 8 years. So we're talking about opportunities, not just in the sense of displacing coal or in terms of the energy transition, but also in just renewing or securing enough to meet current demand.
Dallas, that's really interesting. And, 5 to 8 years isn't that far away from now. Are the discussions starting to take place about who are going to be the suppliers when those contracts do come up and what might be starting to change?
Yeah, that's a great question, Marla. I think for both countries, what we're seeing is this focus, or it has been the focus on, securing supply from nearby supply basins, in particular, Australia, Qatar, or Brunei, Malaysia, a lot of these nearby supply basins closer to South Korea and Japan. And over the last 2 to 5 years, what we're seeing is there's been increased efforts to supply, to source supply from probably further markets. And this is talking about the US and Canada specifically. LNG Canada is definitely one of the biggest projects in Canada that support that. But Japan and Korea are both in many of the projects in the US. So we do see an increasing diversification of supply basins or supply sources for both countries.
And is it national security concerns that are tending to drive those, looking ahead and making those changes, or is it other considerations?
This is a really interesting question. I feel like Juan or Ken might know more about this.
Carl, feel free to leap in.
Right. I think to us, probably I'll just bring out two things. One is right now the US does have, or US or North America in general does have some of the lowest cost LNG resource or the LNG supply in the world, right? Because right now Henry Hub prices is priced somewhere around $3, $3 to $4, whereas global prices in JKM in Asia or in Europe are looking at 12 to 13 right now in today's market. So we're seeing a huge price spread between North America and the Asian markets. So I think there's definitely a cost concern. And the second thing, I think there's definitely the political stability and the fact that the natural resource that we have in North America, Canada, as well as US, that really supports the long-term stability of the energy security going to the future.
Ken, I see your head nodding. It sounds like you've been party to conversations that sound a lot like this.
Yeah, well, so in terms of policy considerations, I think Dallas just mentioned something which was spot on: diversification. When we talk about Japanese, and I'm sure this is probably the same in the Korean energy policy dialogues, but when it comes to energy security, the key strategy for Japan is diversification. Now, when we talk about diversification, we're talking about several things. So energy security is stability in price as well as stability in volumes. So you want affordable materials at good volume at a decent price and over the long run. When we talk about diversification, we're talking about diversity of materials. So not just crude oil, natural gas, but in the recent years, hydrogen and ammonia fuel. That's sort of the policy debate in Japan right now. At the same time, we talk about diversity of supply sources. A lot of these resources exist in certain areas. And for Japan, when we talk about LNG, Canada is not yet one of our import countries. So it'll be great to see sort of diversifications in different regions. I think that's one of sort of the key policy considerations on the Japanese side.
That's great. Thank you for that. Juan, do you have a perspective from the Korean side that you'd like to add here?
Yeah, both Dallas and Ken mentioned it very nicely, and it is the fact that energy security is one of the key topic for discussion. Again, a few minutes ago, I mentioned about affordability of energy, but because of the Ukraine and Russia, energy security and how we're going to secure the energy itself is a big factor. Do you hear music here? Yeah, sorry, PA. Anyway, so diversification is not just to secure a different pricing regime, it's more about differentiating the other sources. So US came in with the big price tag, which is now very affordable. That's what drive the JKM market more affordable than the other TTF markets. But it's not just the JKM itself that we rely on, it's just us getting into a long-term contract to secure gas, natural gas from other sources, including Canada. For instance, when I look at Canada, it's for LNG Canada itself, it's about 14 MTPA of capacity. If we decide to bring all of that 14 MTPA to Korea, that makes about 7 to 8% of our energy need. So we've been relying so much on Middle East before and Australia, which takes about 30% of our energy need. Now Canada comes in, says 7, 8%. US comes in with up to 10% or 11%. That makes us more balanced portfolio on our energy need. Korea Gas Corporation mission statement, when we are responsible for securing LNG for the whole nation, our mission is to secure stable and affordable energy.
But this brings me to a question, Juan, that I'd love to direct to you again. Again, given your role with KOGAS and what you see happen, you personally have worked with the LNG Canada project that's being built in British Columbia that will eventually be shipping LNG abroad. Do you have I want to talk about that project, but before I ask you about that, I'm curious on your perspectives about whether Korea has any preference about whether LNG comes to them from Canada directly or whether going through the US and being exported from the US has any advantage or disadvantage, or is it just, hey, whoever can get it here on a ship first, that's great?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you look at the pricing scheme, so US and Canada, it's same LNG project, but Canada would take more cost because of the lack of infrastructure and the human resources compared to US, of course. But then again, there's an advantage for a Canadian project because it's very close to the market. When you look at the shipping distance, it's about half of the total distance compared to Gulf of Mexico project. And there is less risk about Panama Canal. So again, it relates to our reliability of energy coming in at the right time. But then again, Rocky Mountains and other mountainous area and other factors come in to bring more difficulties in Canadian project. So again, it's not matter where it's coming from, but it's more of how we can secure that gas, and Canada can play a big role in this because it's very, very reliable in a sense.
So that reliability is an interesting question because obviously we've had difficulty getting LNG plants built. LNG Canada has been chugging along for many years. We may have another one behind it, but there's also many that have been turned down. Are Japan and Korea seeing Canada as a reliable energy supplier, particularly on the LNG front, given our stalls so far? Or are we, we're just on the path and I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what is the perspective from Japan and Korea on the reliability of Canada? Carl, do you have anything?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in here as I do work with a lot of Japanese clients that are buying LNG. I would describe it as somewhat hesitant, cautiously optimistic. It's hard, I think they view Canada from a geopolitical perspective and from a security perspective as an ideal partner. It would be great if they could work more with Canada, but I think they're very hesitant just because of the experience with LNG, about 10 to 15 years ago, in terms of the pace of progress and the various obstacles they ran into. Some of them are kind of systemic issues that might maybe unique to Canada that are a challenge to kind of fully resolve, but it would be good to somehow be able to make the process more efficient. I'm speaking specifically with respect to federalism and the fact that the provincial governments in Canada have much more power than Japan may be used to in terms of what a prefectural government in Japan has, which is kind of the equivalent. And the fact that you have the federal government making certain regulations and the provincial governments may be disagreeing with them. And and there's not always certainty around what the regulations are. And then you have the consultation process with the First Nations, which is very important. But again, sometimes I think there's a lack of clarity on the Japanese party sides as to where that's going to go, to what extent they can achieve consensus. There's a lot of built-in obstacles that make it more difficult than some of the other regions that, Australia, Malaysia, Brunei, Qatar, they've all been, and even the US, to be quite frank, the projects in the US, Freeport, it got going on a lot faster and is fully up and running. So
Ken or Carl, what sort of signals do you think that Canada would need to give to show that it's going to be a reliable LNG partner in the future? What would the governments be looking for, or the corporations be looking for, to say this is a signal that we're looking for, that things are going to be more smooth in terms of the sailing from here on out?
I think one of the key points, as Carl mentioned, and I think for the Japanese stakeholders and the investors, one of the key challenges we have is, one is regulatory uncertainty, permits issues, and somehow judicially challenged and overturned. For us, coming from Japan, that is something that we're not familiar with. Another thing is federalism. Japan is a unitary state, so the central government has a lot of power. It takes us a sort of a bit of time to understand federalism in Canada. And one of the key factors, I would say, more from a policy and sort of a high level, is an increased signal of federal and provincial cooperation, as well as interprovincial cooperation. And that, I think that's one of the signals that we're waiting for. Another thing is infrastructure opportunities. I think Canada has great existing infrastructure, and I think that can be sort of ramped up to a next level to sort of put Canada on the global market for the LNG and other resources.
That's a great answer. I want to shift over to a question of cost. And there was a really interesting conversation that came up when we were talking the other day. One, you were talking about Canadian projects costing a lot compared to the US. And we have potentially fewer human resources to deal with this. And then, Dulles, you were sort of countering with saying you have a different perspective, that we're at a point where you think that the low-cost US resources are exhausted. I found this really interesting, so I sort of wanted to rehash it for our audience here. So Juan, starting with you, and again, your perspective with LNG Canada, your experience is that the Canadian projects are just costing more than in the US historically. Is that correct?
There are a lot of factors when you count the cost. Of course, there's the material cost, and there's the human resources, infrastructures, and transportations, and all that. When you look at the material cost itself, it's similar to the US project. Of course, you're bringing in steel pipes and plates, that costs the same. But putting it all together, you need human resources to do so. So these places that we build LNG plants, they're near the shoreline, and due to the other like environment factors and other things, the safety distance that we need to keep from the residential areas, that will put us in the more of a remote area, more than the U.S. Gulf of Mexico projects. So bringing people to there would cost a lot, and their lack of skilled workers that we can pull together. And because of the lack of the heavy haul roads, again, compared to US, we need to build roads to bring in big heavy equipment too. There is other things like power. Again, it's all related to infrastructure that we need to build or we need to beef up. So those are the factors that will cost a lot, because again, I mean, that, and also all of these LNG projects need to be built on the shoreline, and the most of the gas is being produced in between BC and Alberta. So bring those gas to the shoreline would need a pipeline to connect, which in LNG Canada's case, about 670 kilometers long, with 2 great mountains to cross.
True, that's not cheap. Dulles, you had a slightly different perspective, and I'd love to add that into the mix too.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way that we're talking about it is, if you're talking about delivered costs for all the LNG supply going into Northeast Asia, the Japan and South Korean markets, when you look at that, the costs of LNG, landed costs for LNG from Canada, Western Canada, and landed costs for LNG from U.S. Gulf Coast, actually they're very comparable, I think, in our analysis. Part of it, one part is, I guess there are a couple parts. One is just like Wang mentioned, there is the supply cost difference. ACO cost, or the Canadian supply, is cheaper than the Henry Hub, the US cost, but labor is more expensive. Pipeline is more expensive in Canada, but shipping is cheaper in Canada. And right now, I think when you add it all together, one of the latest trends we're seeing is US Gulf Coast projects are seeing this latest wave of, I guess the latest wave of cost inflations are hitting the US Gulf Coast projects. So we are seeing cost escalations around these US Gulf Coast projects. And the fact that, for some of these new green fuel projects, such as Port Arthur, their EPC cost has been disclosed. I think their costs are somewhere north of $900 per ton, and I think the LNG Canada project, it's over $1,000 per ton. But I think in terms of the cost comparison, the latest wave of these new LNG or greenfield LNG projects coming out of the Gulf Coast region is definitely a lot more expensive than the previous waves or previous projects in its iteration. So I think we're talking about now greenfield projects in US Gulf Coast with long distance ship to Asia. Maybe it's benefiting from some of the cost savings from the labors, but when you talk about delivery costs into Asia, Canada actually isn't losing out that much or at all.
This is great. Fascinating. I also want to start segueing into some of the questions around the environment and LNG and other energy sources. Unfortunately, some of the questions and answer questions are helping me along nicely. You guys out there are mirroring exactly the questions that I wanted to ask of the panelists. The first question I want to ask has to do with LNG and emissions itself. The first question might be an unfair one, and you might have difficulty answering it, but I thought let's give it a try. There's a contingent of people who say that it's great to have more LNG coming into Asia, I've heard these arguments around China specifically, but also around Japan and Korea, because it will displace coal in the future. And thus, on a global level, we will have lower emissions. At the same time, there's also other people who are saying, no, there's no proof that it's going to displace coal. We think it's going to displace renewables and lock in a fossil fuel instead of allowing renewables to develop. Do you have any sense of which of these is more likely to be true? Are they somehow both true? Is neither one true? What are you seeing, and what are your perspectives on what the additional import of LNG will do compared to other energy sources? Ken, let's start with you.
Sure, I'll be happy to discuss that. So my perspective is that LNG in the long run will displace coal, and I think that's very likely. In terms of renewables, for Japan, the renewable industry is just beginning to start. But I don't think the renewable industry is big enough to be displaced by LNG. And in particular for Japan, because of sort of the energy security concern I've alluded to, because there is no immediate sort of renewable energy for Japan available at this moment, LNG will sort of take an important role. But over the long run, because Japan has historically been very concerned about dependence on certain regions for its natural resources as well as foreign imports, one of the key energy policy in the most recent energy policy in Japan included upward of 36 to 38% of renewable energy, domestic renewable energy. So in the long run, I think that's going to come towards 2030 and 2050. So I think in the long run, LNG is going to replace coal, but then will slowly be chipped away and replaced by domestic renewable energies. Offshore wind right now in Japan is a very big topic because that's a source of domestic energy, as well as geothermal. So Japan is looking for domestic and renewable energy. So that's my perspective on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Do any of the other of you have any thoughts that you'd like to add in here?
Yeah, I just very quickly, I fully agree with Ken on the Japan side, just in terms of talking to clients and just the deals that I've been working on compared to the past. we disposed of a coal power plant. And on the flip side, I've done some offshore wind transactions and more recent solar, and more recently hydrogen and ammonia. And been talking to the clients, that's the energy clients, the utilities, all they want to do is look for opportunities to invest in renewable energy. That's by far the number one goal right now in terms of what they're looking at in the immediate future. So I fully agree with Ken.
I just add one more thing to that. A couple of minutes ago, I mentioned Korea would need, well, not just Korea, but any other countries that's heavily relying on the imports of energy. We need stable and reliable and affordable energy. Currently in Korea, just about 7% is renewable and about 35% is coal. Now, the reason renewable is staying low at the energy mix is because due to the technology, it still costs a lot to have reliance on the renewables. Electrolyzer costs a lot for hydrogens, and the battery costs a lot for other sources like wind powers or hydropowers too. So altogether, it just doesn't make sense to right now focus only on the renewables. Now, when I says, some people say LNG will push out the renewable investment, but I would rather say it's pushing out more on the more of a coal. So it might not sound like the best choice ever, but it is at least a better choice.
That's great. Thank you. And Dulles, I see you nodding along. Is this in accord with what you're hearing?
Yes, definitely. And I think maybe I can offer another, I guess, angle to it is one is, in terms of the emission intensity, we definitely see, LNG being half of the emission intensity as the coal that it's currently consumed in Japan and Korea, or in Northeast Asia in general. So Northeast Asia imports a lot of coal from Australia, from Indonesia, and those coal definitely, it's very high in emission intensity. So LNG itself helps lower emission intensity, especially given some of the targets that both countries have in terms of new builds for power generation on gas capacity. I think Japan actually recently announced, I think, another 6 gigawatt of new gas capacity by 2030. So those are things on the demand side. But another, I guess, angle to it, is, especially pertaining to our discussion today, is LNG is definitely all different from different places. So is there a cleaner LNG supply source, when you compare all the supply sources? And then this is where I think Canada could, actually benefit from, when you look at the supply source, when you compare all of the LNG supply from Australia, from Qatar, from Middle East, from all the other countries, Canada definitely has a lot of competitive advantage in terms of the emission intensity on the LNG supply side, given the hydroelectric power, for electricity, emissions requirements on the upstream side, and also just the shorter distance to Asia, so that produces, lower emission, in the transport part of the value chain. So we think, there's definitely emissions is a big part of the discussion, and probably one last thing is just. Green LNG is becoming very popular in Asia. I think this is where companies have been buying a lot of the offsets. I think we're seeing that in different parts. We've seen emission tagging happening. So I think the rise of green LNG and carbon offsets will actually propel the LNG industry into I guess focusing more on the emission intensity side, which in turn could help producers like Canada that probably has some of the lower emission intensity LNG than some of the other countries.
Well, this leads right into a question that I'm really curious about. We do have low intensity LNG that will be produced. In fact, the lowest intensity worldwide. From a buyer's perspective, does it matter? Is anybody buying based on the emissions intensity now? And will that change if there's, will it be more desirable later? If not now, if there's more of an LNG abundance? Who would like to take that?
I can add a comment on that. I've been talking to a lot of potential buyers and who are interested in Canada LNG specifically. And because it's a low carbon intensity, it's bringing a lot of attraction and appetite in the market. Well, everybody, not just people in Canada, but every country, every companies, they are all interested in responsibly sourced resources like natural gas.
Mhm.
So it's just a thing that you need to live by with these days. And because that we have a reporting process to government on how much we produce as in terms of CO2, they want to have that tagged along with the LNG that every LNG that we ship out. So yeah, it does actually make a difference that Canada has the lowest emitting LNG.
So will Kogas preferentially buy low emissions LNG? And will you pay
Of
more?
course, of course. Kogas also signed up with the Tokyo, now Paris, what is it called?
Is Kogas willing to pay a premium for low emissions gas?
Kogas is, again, whether that's a premium or not, it depends on how your perspective on that. Of course, we are actually willing to pay premium, but does it really state that we will pay a X dollar amount for CO2 equivalent of what? No, it's not that. It's we go all the way to the source and see what difference this each source has in terms of CO2. And of course, we go all the way to the value chain because it's not just the LNG. LNG takes about 30% of CO2 to liquefy, but it's more to the transportation of the gas and also all the way to the production of the natural gas, who will be feeding into LNG. That's the whole value chain that we need to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to say I agree with Juan, just talking to some of the Japanese clients, and I don't think they think of it in terms of a premium. They think of it as an investment, and the LNG contracts are long term. I think they anticipate, for example, potentially some sort of incentives or subsidies coming in that are related to achieving carbon neutrality goals in Japan, perhaps even requirements, and so in anticipation of that, they want to increase their sources of green LNG or cleaner LNG.
This is great. Broadening the question beyond just emissions to ESG in general, ESG and sustainability have been a real focus for Canadian energy companies over the last number of years. And there's also been a number of schemes that have cropped up to certify what constitutes responsible resource development, like equitable origin. And Dulles, I know you and I had a good conversation about this. Beyond just the emissions question, at this point, does ESG performance of specific companies or countries factor into the purchasing equations or the partnerships that are established by either Korea right now? Or is it really just about emissions, basic human rights, and some of the sort of the basic SDG tenets?
Yeah, ESG is very important, but you really need to look at which country that you're talking about. Kogas specifically has business all over the places, but if we're talking about countries in more developing countries or underdeveloped countries, we support businesses in those countries to abide by the ESG regulations, and we help them make their own policies. But we're talking about project or business in Canada, and our view is that generally our view is that the North America, US, Canada, and Europe would have a very high standard on ESG. So it's I would say that it might be appropriate for us to say, well, you, a business in Canada, need to run your business this and that. It's just it wouldn't be fitting for us.
Dulles, I want to point to you for this question as well, because you're sitting here within Canada and you also have a different view as a trader and with many different geographies that you work with. What are you seeing in terms of trends of purchasing, I'm going to call it high ESG performance companies products? What are you seeing?
For sure. I think right now what we're seeing is just this emergence for responsibly sourced gas, like Wang mentioned. And right now, I think there's definitely different mechanism to make sure your gas is of high ESG standards. There is the carbon tax that people talk about. There's the CB, the carbon border adjustment that Europe is talking about. And there's different mechanism to really measure this is going back to the GHG intensity part of the discussion. But beyond that, the third-party certification in the US is happening right now, has been attracting a lot of attention from European buyers in particular. So what we're seeing is, a lot of these buyers actually specifically say in their contract that, we're sourcing the supply that's responsibly RSG, responsibly sourced gas, as part of their requirement. So I think to them, our trend, or the way that we're looking at it, is definitely Europe is leading the way in terms of having a higher standards around the supply source. What's interesting though is Equitable Origin is a very interesting company that's been certifying gas supply in Canada. And part of the requirement actually includes a lot of the human rights, fair labor, indigenous indigenous rights certifications. So to us, we think this is very applicable to the Canadian markets, because to us, having the respecting First Nation rights is one of the pillars of working in Canada. So I think this certification definitely helps provide more certainty for buyers of Canadian supply into the market. And one interesting aspect is Cambrian Energy is the one that's tied to the wood fiber LNG project, and their upstream supply has also been certified, or it's looking for certification from the Equitable Origin. So we do think the trend is emerging, and there's definitely a movement around sourcing more of the responsibly sourced gas even within the North American markets. So we definitely are watching how that develops.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to turn now to the topic of hydrogen. It's the last one on my list, and fortunately is also the subject of several questions here in the Q&A. And so we'll go right from here to the Q&A. So if you have any burning questions, get your typing fingers out. I'm going to phrase this the way that we have Allison from Vancouver Tech Journal has written this. She said, could our panelists elaborate more on Japanese and Korean interest in hydrogen and what its export looks like? And I will say, I don't want to put Juan too much on the spot, because Juan, I know this is not something where you can speak for the government either. And so we might just wind up focusing much more on Japan. But Ken, can we start with you on what the picture of hydrogen looks like in Japan for the future?
Sure, that's a great question, actually. And in terms of Canada and LNG and everything we've discussed so far, I think that's sort of the next step we'll probably be seeing in the future. So in terms of hydrogen, Japan made this statement in late 2020 that we'll be net zero by 2050. So that was a sort of a big signal. But even before that, in 2017, Japan was one of the first countries to make a national strategy on hydrogen. We followed it up in 2019 with the hydrogen roadmap. And in 2019, we also identified sort of a key strategic areas for hydrogen deployment, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And in the most recent energy plan, which is basically like our policy document on how we see some energy developments, Japan placed hydrogen as sort of a key future resource that's basically going to be there together with crude oil and natural gas and other major energy forms. And Japan has a concrete sort of plan of using hydrogen for the natural gas powered fire plants, possibly up to 30% of hydrogen mix. Now, we kind of have to take a step back that the Japanese policy says by 2030, hydrogen and its derivative ammonia fuel is going to constitute about 1% of the total power mix. Now, even then, though, that's still a very strong signal from the government, and the sort of the benchmark price we're looking at is, I think it's around, by 2030, it'll be around 30 yen per cubic meters of hydrogen with 3,000 tons of hydrogen production. And that'll be sort of, the price will decrease to 20 yen per cubic meters by 2050. And we're looking at hydrogen production of, or import of, I think that's 10 million. Yeah, 10 million.
So
that's sort of
which Japan has its own domestic hydrogen production at any significant scale?
No, well, so there are several ways you can make hydrogen, right? But one of the sort of the key it could be green hydrogen, but the problem is you have to use hydropower, or you have to have an abundance of natural renewable energy, which Japan does have hydro, but our other forms of renewable is still in its nascent stage. So what could fill the gap in the meantime, right? So that's possibly blue hydrogen made from natural gas, where it's affordable and environmental sound, and injecting the CCS, CO2, which is a byproduct, into the ground as CCS. So that's some of the concepts we have, and we're looking at foreign partners that could potentially bring hydrogen in its various forms, whether liquefied or turned into other hydrogen carriers. So that's where we are, and we're excited to see how this will develop in the coming years.
Is there any chance you think that Japan will use nuclear energy to produce hydrogen domestically?
That's a very interesting question, because Japan has restarted its nuclear power plants, but it was shut down, and there's still sort of the lasting sentiments from the great earthquake in 2012. So would nuclear power be used to crack hydrogen and produce it domestically? I don't know, possibly, but I don't see currently a big push towards it. I think it's more sort of the blue hydrogen that we're looking at, possibly in the long run replaced by green hydrogen. I think that's sort of where the policy is sort of heading in the next few years.
And in terms of importing hydrogen, is it mostly in the form of ammonia, or are you balancing it out in the different ways? Pure hydrogen by ship, which I don't even know if it's possible yet, attaching it to like toluene or some of the chemicals. Like, how is Japan planning on actually getting it into the country?
I think currently the way it works with hydrogen is we're looking at building value chains of hydrogen, and the hydrogen value chain could be in different forms. And as Marla, as you've just mentioned, it could be, so hydrogen, one way is you liquefy hydrogen, but you have to make it very cold and it's very energy intensive. But that can be done with hydrogen, liquefied hydrogen carriers. Another method is using MCH, so it's sort of a type of toluene, but you need infrastructure development to sort of convert it into toluene and then convert it back. Another discussion is ammonia fuel as a potential hydrogen carrier, and basically using ammonia fuel as it is and using it for previously coal-fired power plants, sort of mixing it with a coal-fired power plant. So that's sort of the possible scenarios we're looking at in terms of hydrogen power supply chains.
And I'm also interested in what appears to me from the outside, or maybe this may be dated, a shift in Japan, rather than going to electric vehicles, more of a preference for hydrogen-driven vehicles in the future. Is that correct, that it's going to be a hydrogen personal vehicle economy?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the downstream side of things, but what I'm seeing from sort of the energy industry as a whole is that Japan is definitely sort of trying to create demand for hydrogen vehicles and sort of the hydrogen use. Now, there still has to be, a lot of infrastructure built and a lot of developments on the demand side as well. So I think Japan is approaching the supply side in terms of getting hydrogen to Japan or its derivative forms into Japan, at the same time trying to sort of scale up the domestic demand and the domestic consumer use of hydrogen.
This is great. I'm gonna read you a question here, and that's probably maybe either Dulles or Juan, you might be best positioned to answer this. This one says, Japan and Korea import LNG from Australia. How does Australia's potential LNG export controls factor into the diversity mix for the two countries?
You want me to jump in?
Sure.
I can probably, to us, I think, there's definitely the concerns about export controls or Australian, because there's quite a bit of I think the focus right now in Australia is really about the Eastern markets and their gas shortage in the market. So I think right now what we're seeing is just the potential of how Australia is solving its energy crisis right now on the East Coast. And that's part of the reason why I think, for countries to look for diversified supply is to look at different parts of the value chain or different regions for that. I think this is probably a case where some of the contracts, and we do track, a lot of the contracts when they come up for expiration, and as they become, or as they up for renewal or renegotiation, I think this is probably one of the concerns in terms of energy supply reliability, or this is where you can look at different places to replace your supply in the long term. So we definitely think, there's concern around that. And also we think, and opportunities for renegotiations, it's also probably going to happen over the next 3 to 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, Dallas mentioned it correctly. And if I can just add just one thing. Shipping distance-wise, Australia is comparable to Canada. Even if there is an export control, or even if not, we'll still rely heavily on Australian LNG. Korea is. We still need to diversify. It's not just the Middle East that we're trying to avoid our reliance, but it's also Australia. And some of the projects that we already participate as a buyer and also as a project developer, those projects, the volumes from those projects will be our base load. But it's hard to assume that we're going to add more reliance on Australia.
Thank you for that. I'm going to read a last question that I know that we're not going to be able to answer. So Pat, in the background, have your glass of water, straighten your tie. The question that I'm reading this because I think it's an important question, but we actually did discuss it in our pre-webinar prep session last week, and this isn't the right group necessarily to answer this. The question is there a realistic opportunity for ITMOs, these are the international transfers of offset emissions, to be utilized for Canada to balance their carbon ledger while scaling up their export of LNG that damages their carbon emissions target? It's a huge question, and it's something that I know at Canada West Foundation we keep chewing on, because we do have, this head-to-head problem of a net zero emissions cap, and that if we draw the boundaries around Canada, it helps keep our emissions down. But at the same time, we may have the opportunity with LNG to reduce global emissions, but these things are in conflict from an accounting perspective. We know that Japan is also leading a charge of trying to work this out under Article 6, but we may have to have another webinar about this. It's a fascinating topic. So with this, I would like to thank the panelists, the ambassadors so much. I'd also like to thank Bennet Jones for its sponsorship. And I'm delighted to turn the mic over to Pat McGuire from Bennet Jones to wrap up with some concluding thoughts. And thank you to everyone for attending as well.
Thanks a lot, Marla. Thanks to the Canada West Foundation, Gary, for hosting the webinar. Let me also pass along our thanks to the participants, the ambassadors, Yamanouchi, Kanji, and Im Wong Sun, and particularly to our panelists, Ken Mizutami from JOGMEC, Carl Perez from Shearman Sterling and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Japan, Dulles Wang from Wood Mackenzie, and Wan Cho from Kogas. It's been most enlightening to listen to the discussion today. Bennet Jones is really proud to have been able to sponsor this Canada West Foundation webinar. For many decades, we've played an important part of the development of Canadian energy resources, whether acting for investors, energy project developers, or others. And we've seen many cycles in the Canadian energy industry. And I gotta say, in 30 years of doing this is probably the most complex cycle that we've seen. We have geopolitical uncertainty. We have international need for countries to find places for energy security, all in the context of decarbonization and increased emphasis on ESG, and some Canadian-specific risks. But on the question of whether Canada can provide clean, secure energy to Japan and Korea, I remain, I think it was Carl's words, cautiously optimistic. I'm cautious for a few reasons. Like many, I was disappointed to see little or no commitment at a federal level to increasing efforts to supply LNG to our reliable allies in Asia, particularly during these uncertain times. And we got to acknowledge the headwinds caused by the Canadian regulatory uncertainty and delays. We've spoken a little bit about the frustration around development of infrastructure, and I would extend that to critical minerals extraction as well. And while many First Nations and Indigenous communities see meaningful benefit in participating in the economic development in the energy sector, this interest is not universally held, and the process for resolving areas of disagreement between developers, our governments, and our First Nations and Indigenous partners can take some time to resolve. So there's plenty of reasons why this optimism is cautious. That said, I think we remain optimistic. In a world of increasing geopolitical uncertainty, trade among three good allies is only going to increase. These are three countries historically reliant on foreign trade, There are locational advantage to increasing trade among Japan, Korea, and Canada. And Canada has many good reasons to support the energy security of Japan and Korea, particularly in this evolving world order. And importantly, Canada has the ability to contribute to this energy supply security, whether it be LNG, but also I would note methanol and ammonia, which we touched on briefly today, hydrogen, which can come from Canada in a very clean hydrogen form, whether generated through hydroelectric power or natural gas consumption coupled with CCUS. We touched a little bit on uranium and SMRs, which I know that is an important part of what Canada and Korea and others have been discussing. And Canada's abundance of critical minerals, which we just need to be able to get out of the ground and make sure it can make its way to Japan and Korea. And a couple notes coming out of the discussion today, and Dulles had mentioned it, and Marla as well, around, Canada has a pretty sophisticated system for generating emissions reductions and generating offsets and credit trading. And increasingly, Canadian energy companies are focused on ESG. We think that Canadian energy producers can meet these international objectives in increasing search for cleaner and ESG friendly energy. And I think also we should note that Canada, Japan, and Korea will also benefit from Canada's need for Japanese and Korean investment here, whether it be in technology, equipment, the solar, wind, and other renewable areas where we are very reliant on Japanese and Korean parts. The integration of the Canadian and Japanese and Korean sectors around SMRs, and also batteries and energy storage solutions. I think there's great opportunities for greater collaboration between the three countries in that area. So when you put it together, again, to answer the question, can Canada provide clean, secure energy to meet the increasing demands of Japan and Korea? I believe so. So thanks, Canada West Foundation, for hosting this. Thank you for our participants. And thanks for those of you that have participated by joining us online. For those of you in Canada, have a happy Valentine's Day. For our friends overseas, have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.